Bloomberg Audio Studios.
Podcasts, radio, news.
Everyone agrees we need to spend more on defence. We need to do that to meet the increasing threats that we face. And what I'm doing today is making the case that it isn't just how much you spend, but it's how you spend it. And an essential part of our national security, our strength and resilience for the future, is the defence industry that Britain has.
John Healey, the Defence Secretary, speaking to Bloomberg today, setting out the start of his new defence industrial strategy. Are his plans enough to navigate an increasingly insecure world? Hello, you're listening to Bloomberg UK Politics. I'm Caroline Hepker.
And I'm Yuan. Welcome to the programme. Now, this week, Keir Starmer is unveiling what he calls his plan for change. It's a bid to reset his administration after a rather turbulent start, which has seen his poll numbers plummeting. We're expecting targets in areas such as economic growth, crime reduction and healthcare reform. Today, the government is setting out its plans for defence. Economic growth has up to now been the key focus for ministers, but the issue of national security has been rumbling on in the background with ongoing conflict in Ukraine and the Middle East. And of course, the election of Donald Trump to the US presidency has hastened the need for European nations to reassess their defence strategies.
Well, it does seem like a new defence industrial strategy being announced today. The start of these plans is the government trying to marry up the ambitions of bolstering economic growth and also Britain's defence resources. The plans say that UK-based defence firms will be prioritised for government investment. It's a move that's supposed to boost British jobs and strengthen national security. In the release itself, the government admits that global threats are increasing. So the question is, will this be enough? Will it also placate President-elect Trump, who has said repeatedly that he wants to raise the bar for NATO members' defence spending? Well, joining us now to discuss is Bloomberg's political editor, Alex Wickham. Alex, thank you for being with us. What are the main points of this? The government has called it a strategy. It's actually the start of a consultation process. How significant is the announcement today?
You're right. I mean, rather than detail being announced today, it is very much another review, another consultation, as we've started to get used to under this government. Keir Starmer's administration does seem to like launching a review rather than announcing a new policy, with sort of answers on a postcard as to what the actual detail will eventually be. This is big stuff. It is obviously a very important issue. They're talking about strengthening supply chains in critical industries, making defence an engine for growth for the UK, quite flowery language, but it is important. There is huge sums of money in it. It's not the first time that the British government has geared investment towards UK defence companies. That tends to be what happens in defence. So it's not particularly new ideas so far, but obviously a hugely important issue in the context of rising geopolitical threats, particularly with Russia and China.
Yeah, Alex, I wanted to ask you about that actually. It says that UK defence firms will be prioritised for government investment. Is that a euphemism for protectionism? Is it giving contracts to UK firms regardless of the price? I mean, even more than we do already.
It's a really interesting question because, typically that is what happens in defence anyway. However, there have been sort of calls in Europe for a bit more of a Europe-wide defence industrial strategy and, some sort of suggestion that Keir Starmer, as a more pro-EU politician than his Conservative predecessors, might be up for a bit of that. Emmanuel Macron has sort of eventually come round to the idea that EU defence investment doesn't have to just stay within the EU. So it'd be interesting to see whether this government sees an opportunity there for more cooperation with more European defence companies. Obviously, a lot of defence is multi-country as well. But in a sort of post or current Trump world, it is interesting to see one arm of the government talk about free trade and another arm of the government talk about Britain first.
Yeah, I mean, interoperability, the increased threats. I mean, there are so many very significant issues to think about. I mean, you've got to remember that only a couple of weeks ago, Healey scrapped Royal Navy vessels in order to cut costs. But today, the Defence Secretary, speaking to us on Bloomberg TV and radio, discussed a bit about this new strategy. He was speaking to our UK correspondent, Lizzy. Have a listen to what he said.
It's part of, if you like, the framework we need in this country for the future. A combination of investors, innovators and industry pulling together, because in the end, And armed forces are only as strong as the industry that stands behind them. And faced with the threats of the future, we have to have an industrial strategy that is able to measure up.
OK, able to measure up. The target that Labour has set out is 2.5% of GDP spent on defence. Do we have any details on that? Do we get into the nitty-gritty yet of new weapons, extra manpower? I'd like to point out that 2.5% of GDP is GDP that has stagnated for a decade, whereas, the US has grown enormously. So, in terms of real money spent on defence, it's sluggish.
These are the serious questions that John Healey is going to need to answer, and hasn't so far. We are hearing that Labour has essentially pushed back its timeline for when it's going to announce a timeline on 2.5%. Again, the detail is never there, and they were supposed to tell us when they were going to hit 2.5 by March. Now it looks more like June. If you're Donald Trump coming in, and obviously, as we know, he very much wants European countries to increase their defence spending, he's going to be asking very quickly when and why that timeline is being pushed back. Probably the reason is that Rachel Reeves, the Chancellor, has very difficult decisions to make on public spending. And the spending review that she is taking is being pushed back also to June, it sounds like. There is this potential disconnect between an MOD, which obviously will want to get there as soon as it can, will have a biggest budget as possible as soon as it can, and a Chancellor whose job it is to rein in public finances. That is a tension. It will remain to be seen who wins. We're sort of seeing the idea that perhaps they could get to 2.5 in 2 or 3 years' time. The Chancellor may have a different view. But all the meanwhile, Putin's invasion in Ukraine is ongoing, and it is not exactly a strong message that we're going to be getting nearly a year into a Labour government without any clarity on their main defence policy.
So no timeline on the timeline. But talking of money, did we learn anything about improving procurement in the MOD? Lousy and wasteful procurement is something that we've been talking about in the UK for, well, as long as I remember, really.
Again, lots of nice words from John Healey said about how they would like to do exactly that. It absolutely is objective of his of his department, but again, details thin on the ground. This is becoming a little bit of a theme across the government for Keir Starmer as he launches this big reset this week. He is trying to set specific targets in different areas, none in defence, by the way, but to try to put some meat on the bone of what he's trying to achieve and convince people that he does have a plan. But the very fact that he's having to do that does rather suggest that he hasn't been convincing people so far.
For anyone who's keen-eyed, they will have noticed the preparations that are going on. I mean, 2 new NATO members joined post the Russian conflict in Ukraine. Norway and Sweden are preparing their populations for possible conflict, putting out brochures and so on about how people can prepare themselves, 72 hours preparedness. And in the last 18 months, you notice army and other military officials in the UK also warning, that we've gone from post-war to pre-war. Is the UK getting better prepared for conflict? Is there any of this that is sort of cutting through to the population, aside from government policy?
Army chiefs have said in recent days that, Britain's ready to fight tonight if ready. But, listening to John Healey today in his Bloomberg interview, it wasn't the most convincing answer on that. He was sort of saying, well, there's a lot of work to be done to get the army up to speed. Well, that's going to take time. And the difficulty that the government has, to be fair to them, is we don't know how much time they have. And, certainly what happens in Ukraine over the next few months when Trump comes in will be, a key factor in that. But the general expectation is that there is an extremely aggressive Russia, a pretty aggressive China as well, and that the chances of a wider conflict are high. And certainly from the rhetoric that we've had from the government about, and even the previous government, about how the military in this country has been hollowed out, how these old programs have to be scrapped because they're no good anymore, we have to put money into new things. Yeah, but it takes time to build those new things and get them active. So that is the key question, and I think the government is not giving the most convincing answers on it today. But that's part of the problem, is the longer it takes to hold these consultations and hold these reviews before they come up with an actual decision on what they're going to spend money on and how much money they're going to spend, just pushes the timeline even further back.
Yeah, so there are plenty of threats. The Prime Minister has repeatedly made a key point about building better relationships with our European neighbours. How does this strategy align with defence plans on the continent? There's a big concern, isn't there, about the lack of interoperability of much of the equipment that's bought by other European countries?
If you just look at GCAP, which is a next generation fighter jet programme, there are sort of suggestions from John Healey today that Britain would be keen to welcome Saudi Arabia into the programme. I think the other partners might have something to say about that. So it is very much, again, details yet to be decided. Yeah. And there is this opportunity for Britain. And even in the last government, there were officials in the MOD who really wanted to have closer relations with Europe on defence. It just made sense to sort of pool resources, and areas where Britain is stronger than other countries, like its navy, perhaps could do more, and other countries which have perhaps better capabilities in other areas Britain could rely on. I think we will start to see just inevitably a bit more of that sort of thing going on as Starmer resets this relationship with the EU.
Okay, a last thought then on the reset, because this is sort of day one of what's expected to be a week of fresh announcements. Is this the thing that's going to turn around the fortunes of this government that have been faltering rather?
It has been a very stuttering start. I think even speaking to people loyal to Starmer in the Labour Party, they have been surprised at how poor the start has been. Not all of it the government's fault necessarily, outside factors, of course, at play, but nonetheless, lots of work to be done. I mean, I'm not getting the impression from my conversations with anybody in government that these targets are particularly game-changing. Okay, he's going to aim to improve GDP per capita by the time of the next election. Well, you would hope so. Does that mean he's done a great job? Voters will decide. And I think what he really needs is to be able to communicate to voters and the media that, the things that he said he was going to bring: integrity, stability, competence, a sort of vision for improving the country and public services. I think we need a little bit more of that from Keir Starmer, and some targets here and there about how individual specific policy areas may be slightly improved in 5 years. Okay, it's a step, but it's going to need a lot more than that. And he does risk a bit of a narrative setting in that he didn't have a plan when he came in.
Yeah, perhaps the first reset of the new government. Interesting to see how many more we get over the next months and years. That's our political editor, Alex Wickham. Thanks for joining us on the show today.
OK, so food for thought then at the start of this reset week from the Labour government. That's it from us for today. We'll have much more, of course, in the coming days. If you like the programme, don't forget to subscribe. Give it 5 stars so that other people can find it on Apple Podcasts, Spotify or wherever you listen.
This episode was produced by Tiwa Adebayo and our audio engineer was Stephen Gonzalez. I'm Yuan Potts.
And I'm Caroline Hepker. We'll be back with more tomorrow. This is Bloomberg.
Bloomberg UK Politics. Listen weekdays at noon on DAB Digital Radio in London.